Her tuition debt forces her into a risky side hustle. When her sister exposes it, she faces humiliation, but then learns the sister's motive was darker than jealousy. The red ink on the final notice didn't just look like a warning. It looked like a crime scene. I sat at my small kitchen table, the laminate peeling at the corners, staring at a number that refused to shrink no matter how many double shifts I pulled. $14,200. That was the price of my final year of university, the cost of the better life everyone promised me if I just worked hard enough. My breath hitched as I realized my 3 honest jobs, the library front desk, the coffee shop, and the late-night cleaning crew, barely covered the interest. I was running on a treadmill that was slowly moving backward, pulling me toward a cliff. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my future dissolving into a series of minimum wage paychecks and hollow apologies to the registrar's office. I needed a way out, something that didn't involve begging or borrowing from banks that had already slammed their doors in my face. That's when I heard about the deliveries. It started as a whisper in the back of the campus lounge, a tip from a guy who knew a guy. They needed someone who looked invisible, someone who didn't look like a criminal. They needed a girl with a heavy backpack and a desperate heart. My first night on the job felt like stepping through a mirror into a world where the air was thick with the scent of expensive cedar and the heavy, sweet musk of imported cigars. I arrived at the back entrance of a nondescript dry cleaners at 2 a.m., my palms so damp I had to wipe them on my jeans every 30 seconds. A man with a face like etched granite handed me a leather satchel. It was heavier than it looked. My job was simple. Walk 4 blocks to a black sedan, hand it over, and walk back. As I stepped into the dimly lit alley, the silence of the city felt deafening. Every click of my heels against the pavement sounded like a gunshot. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck, a physical manifestation of the terror that I was carrying enough cash to change my life, or end it. When I reached the car and the window rolled down, I saw the glint of gold watches and the sharp, predatory eyes of men who played for keeps. The exchange took 5 seconds. When I returned to the cleaners and was handed a stack of bills that equaled a month of my barista wages, the fear didn't vanish. It transformed into a dark, electric hum in my veins. It was a dangerous medicine, a bitter pill I had to swallow just to keep my seat in the classroom. The following Tuesday, the tension shifted from the streets to my own living room. I had made a mistake. A small vanity-driven error. With my first delivery payment, I bought a pair of sturdy, designer boots. My old ones had holes in the soles that let the rain in, and I thought I deserved one thing that didn't feel broken. As I sat at the dinner table pushing a pile of mashed potatoes around my plate, I felt Clara's eyes on them. My sister didn't say anything at first, just sipped her water with a slow, methodical grace that always made me feel unkempt. "Those are nice, Sarah," she finally remarked, her voice as smooth as glass. "Leather? They look like they cost more than a semester of books." I forced a laugh, claiming I found them at a thrift shop across town, but I could see the gears turning behind her eyes. Clara started asking about my library shifts, noting that I seemed to be getting home much later than usual. It wasn't sisterly concern. It was a deposition. Later that night, I heard the faint creak of my bedroom door. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering against my ribs as I watched my sister's silhouette move toward my desk. She was looking for a paper trail, her shadow stretching long and thin across my floor like a predator hunting in the dark. The reality of the risk I was taking finally caught up to me on a rainy Thursday during a drop-off near the docks. I was sitting in my beat-up car, the satchel tucked under the passenger seat, waiting for the contact. Suddenly the world turned blue and red. A police cruiser pulled up behind me, the spotlight cutting through the torrential rain and illuminating my shaking hands. I felt the blood drain from my face. In that moment, I didn't see my tuition being paid. I saw a mugshot, a prison cell, and the disappointed ghost of my mother. My entire future was sitting 6 inches away from the officer's flashlight. When the knock came on the window, I rolled it down, my voice trembling as I played the role of the lost, tired student. "I'm just trying to find my way back to the main road, officer." My GPS cut out. I lied, the words tasting like lead. He looked at my student ID, then at the empty coffee cups on the floorboards. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe I just looked pathetic enough to be harmless. He told me to move along and be careful. I drove 3 miles away before I had to pull over and throw up. The stakes weren't just about money anymore. They were about my soul. I was a ghost in my own life, haunted by the very thing that was supposed to save me. By the end of the month, a strange sense of peace settled over me, though it was as fragile as thin ice. I had done it. Between the deliveries and my grueling hours at the cafe, I finally had the full amount for the semester tucked away in a shoebox under a loose floorboard. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. That evening I found Clara sitting on the porch watching the sunset. In a rare moment of warmth I sat beside my sister, and we talked about the summers we spent at our grandmother's house, catching fireflies in mason jars. I felt a wave of guilt for being so suspicious of her. I leaned my head on her shoulder and told her how relieved I was that the financial pressure was finally lifting. I didn't give details, but I spoke about how hard work finally pays off if you're willing to do what others won't. I thought we were bonding, that the distance between us was finally closing. What I didn't see was the slight bulge of my sister's phone in her apron pocket, the screen glowing dimly as it recorded every word of my vague confession. I didn't see the cold, calculating smile she hid as she tucked a stray hair behind my ear. I was celebrating my freedom, unaware that I had just handed my sister the keys to my cage. The morning of graduation felt like the first day of the rest of my life. The sun was unusually bright, reflecting off the polished marble of the university courtyard where hundreds of us sat in neat rows of folding chairs. I adjusted my cap, feeling the weight of the tassel against my temple. I looked over at the guest section and saw my sister Clara, waving with a smile that looked perfectly proud. I felt a surge of genuine love for her. I thought we had finally moved past the tension of the previous months. The dean stood at the podium, his voice booming through the speakers about integrity and the bright futures awaiting the leaders of tomorrow. Then the large digital screens behind him, meant to display a celebratory montage of student life, flickered and hissed with static. A video began to play, but it wasn't a slideshow of campus memories. It was a grainy, high-definition clip of me standing in that damp alleyway, handing over the leather satchel to the man in the black sedan. The audio was crisp, my own voice clear as a bell discussing the delivery fee. The silence that followed was more violent than any scream. I felt the air leave my lungs as if I'd been struck. Around me, the sea of black gowns shifted as heads turned toward me, eyes widening in a mixture of shock and disgust. My name appeared on the screen next to a scanned copy of my recent bank deposits, amounts that no student could ever justify. The dean stopped speaking, his face hardening into a mask of pure disappointment. I looked back at Clara, expecting to see her in shock, but she wasn't moving. She was just sitting there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the screen with a calm, almost clinical interest. The courtyard began to spin. The faces of my classmates blurred into a kaleidoscope of judgment. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like water. I realized in that heartbeat that I wasn't just losing my reputation, I was losing everything I had bled and sweated for over the last 4 years. The security guards began to move toward my row, and the murmur of the crowd grew into a deafening roar of condemnation. By sunset, the world I knew had turned into a frozen wasteland. The university board didn't even wait for a formal hearing. The evidence was too damning. They stripped me of my degree requirements and banned me from campus grounds effective immediately. I walked home in my street clothes, my graduation gown stuffed into a trash can 3 blocks back. As I turned onto our street, I saw the neighbors, people who had known me since I was a little girl, pulling their children inside and closing their curtains. My phone was a graveyard of friends who had blocked my number or sent vitriolic messages about how they never really knew me. When I stepped into the house, the silence was thick and suffocating. Clara was in the kitchen, brewing a pot of herbal tea as if it were any other Tuesday. She didn't look up when I came in. "I did it for your own good, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with a terrifying kind of piety. "You were lost in a dark world and I had to save your soul before you ended up in a pine box. Humiliation is a small price to pay for your salvation." She looked at me then, her eyes shining with a smug, righteous light that chilled me to the bone. I spent the next 2 days in a trance, confined to my room while the weight of the betrayal settled into my marrow. I decided I couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. I began pulling old suitcases out from under the bed, throwing my few belongings inside with shaking hands. I needed my birth certificate and the old family documents we kept in a fireproof box in the hallway closet near Clara's room. As I reached for the box, I bumped into a loose floorboard, one I knew Clara used to hide her childhood diaries. Curiosity, or perhaps a lingering instinct for survival, made me pry it up. Underneath wasn't a diary. It was a thick black leather ledger. I opened it, expecting more of her righteous notes, but my breath stopped when I saw the columns of numbers. They were dated back to the month our mother passed away. I realized with a sickening jolt that Clara hadn't just been watching me. She had been systematically draining our mother's estate. The tuition money that was supposed to be mine, the shortfall the bank had told me about, it was all here, transferred into an offshore account in her name. She had stolen nearly $80,000 from my future. I sat on the floor, the ledger heavy in my lap, as the horror of her plan fully materialized. She didn't expose me to save me. She exposed me because she knew I was starting to get suspicious about the money. She destroyed my reputation so that if I ever found this book and tried to accuse her, no one would believe a criminal card runner over the saintly sister who tried to help her. My grief turned into a cold, hard knot of fury. But before I could even process the betrayal, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the front door. It wasn't a neighborly knock. I crept to the window and saw a man I recognized from the gambling ring. He looked agitated, his hand resting on the small of his back where a weapon would be hidden. Clara opened the door, her voice trembling as she tried to use her good girl persona on him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whimpered. The man stepped inside, forcing his way into the foyer. "Your sister didn't make the final drop," he growled. "She owes us $20,000 or we start taking it out of this house." Clara turned as white as a sheet, her eyes darting toward me on the stairs. She had no idea how to handle men like this. For the first time the power shifted. I knew exactly who he was and I knew how to speak his language. I walked down the stairs, the ledger tucked behind my back, and met the man's eyes with a level of calm that terrified even me. I told him the money would be sorted, but not by me. I watched Clara's holy facade crumble in real time as the man turned his glare toward her. Once he was gone, after I promised him a meeting at the cleaners the next morning, I walked into the kitchen and dropped the black ledger onto the table with a resounding thud. Clara stared at it as if it were a poisonous snake. "You want to talk about saving souls, Clara?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. "Let's talk about Mom's money. Let's talk about how you stole my life before I ever stepped into that alley." She tried to stammer out an excuse, her eyes filling with fake tears, but the air in the room had changed. She wasn't the protector anymore and I wasn't the victim. I realized she had wanted to bankrupt my character so I would never have the standing to question the inheritance. We stood there in the dim kitchen light, the remnants of our family history laid bare between us, as I prepared to show her exactly what happens when you push a desperate woman too far. The silence in the kitchen after the man left was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of defeat anymore. I stared at Clara across the table, the black ledger sitting between us like an unexploded bomb. She tried to reach for it, her fingers trembling, but I slammed my hand down on the leather cover. My mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. I realized that to beat her, I couldn't rely on the good girl ethics that had gotten me crushed at graduation. I needed to fight from the shadows she had forced me into. That night, instead of sleeping, I reached out to Marcus, a digital specialist I'd met through the gambling ring. We met at a 24-hour diner on the edge of the city, the air smelling of burnt coffee and desperation. I handed him the ledger and the account numbers I'd found. "I need to know where this money went and I need the paper trail to lead back to her, not the estate," I told him. Marcus looked at me with a newfound respect. He saw that the desperate student was gone, replaced by someone with a cold, calculated edge. For 3 nights, we worked in his dimly lit apartment, tracing the digital crumbs Clara had left behind. This wasn't about being good anymore. It was about survival. Through Marcus, I discovered the depths of Clara's hypocrisy. She hadn't just stolen the money for a rainy day. She had been feeding a secret addiction to high-stakes online trading and offshore betting, the very world she claimed to be saving me from. As I watched the data scroll across the screen, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Every time she had lectured me about my soul, she had been using my stolen tuition to cover her own losses. I spent the next week meticulously planning her downfall. I didn't want to just report her. I wanted her to feel the same public disintegration I had experienced. I began to play the part of the broken, subservient sister. I apologized for the danger I'd brought to the house and suggested a quiet peace-offering dinner to discuss how we would sell the house to pay back the men from the ring. I made sure to sound defeated, let my shoulders slump, and avoided eye contact. I saw the spark of triumph in Clara's eyes. She thought she had finally broken me, and that overconfidence was the first brick in the wall of the trap I was building. The night of the dinner, the house was filled with the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary, a domestic scene that felt like a lie. I had hidden 3 recording devices around the dining room and invited Mr. Henderson, our mother's longtime estate attorney, to arrive late under the guise of finalizing the house sale documents. I sat across from Clara, pouring her a glass of wine with a steady hand. "I just don't understand, Clara," I said softly, staring into my plate. "How did you manage to keep things going when the estate funds ran so low? You were always so much smarter than me." She leaned back, the wine and the sense of total victory loosening her tongue. She began to brag, her voice filled with a haughty, misplaced pride. She detailed how easy it had been to forge the signatures on the tuition checks and how she had timed the leak of my video to coincide with the bank's final audit of the estate. "It was brilliant, really," she laughed, a sharp, jarring sound. "If you're a disgraced criminal, Sarah, no one asks why your bank account is empty. They just assume you spent it on your lifestyle. I didn't just save myself. I gave you a story that explained away my own genius." Just as she took a celebratory sip of her wine, the front door opened. It wasn't the gambling debt collectors she feared. It was Mr. Henderson, accompanied by 2 investigators from the Financial Crimes Division. I stood up slowly, the broken mask falling away to reveal a face of stone. The look of pure, frozen terror that washed over Clara was a mirror image of what I had felt in the university courtyard. Her glass shattered against the floor, red wine spreading like a stain across the white tile. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his face a mask of profound disappointment. "We've heard enough, Clara," he said, holding up his phone, which had been receiving the live audio feed. The darker motive was laid bare in the middle of our family kitchen. She hadn't been protecting the family name, she had been cannibalizing it to fuel her own greed. As the investigators read her rights, she looked at me with a hatred so deep it felt physical. But for the first time in months, the weight on my chest didn't feel like debt. It felt like justice. The weeks that followed were a grueling gauntlet of legal meetings and public statements. Reclaiming my reputation was like trying to put a shattered mirror back together. I had to face the university board again, this time with Mr. Henderson by my side and the evidence of Clara's fraud in hand. While they couldn't ignore my involvement with the card running, I negotiated a deal. I turned over every bit of information I had on the gambling ring. The names, the drop sites, the ledger of their operations. In exchange, the university agreed to a deferred adjudication, allowing me to complete my degree through a different institution provided I performed extensive community service. The process was bittersweet. The thief label was gone, replaced by the complicated truth of a girl who did the wrong things for the right reasons. The whispers in the neighborhood didn't stop overnight, but I no longer looked at the ground when I walked past the windows. The scars of Clara's betrayal remained, a constant reminder that the people closest to you can be the most dangerous, but my name was finally my own again. 6 months later, I stood in the center of my new apartment. It was small, barely enough room for a bed and a desk, but it was mine. There were no hidden ledgers, no past due notices, and most importantly, no Clara. She was facing a lengthy sentence for embezzlement and fraud, a fate she had built for herself brick by brick. I looked out the window at the city lights, reflecting on the journey. I had lost my sister, my inheritance, and the innocent version of myself that believed hard work was always rewarded fairly. But I had gained a strength that couldn't be taught in a classroom. I had paid off my debts, not with the dirty money from the satchels, but through the sheer will to survive the fire. As I sat down at my desk to start my first real job as a junior paralegal, a position Mr. Henderson helped me secure, I realized that blood isn't always thicker than water. Sometimes, it's just a trail that leads you to the person you were always meant to become. I picked up my pen, the air in the room finally clear, and began to write the first chapter of a life defined by my own choices and nothing else.